Elliot Rowe had never been a man of impulse. Every decision in his life had been calculated, measured, rooted in logic. After 3 decades spent writing analytical publications dissecting bureaucratic systems, human error patterns, and manipulative group behavior, he had grown tired of watching society repeat its mistakes while rewarding those who made them loudest. He didn't retreat from the world in bitterness. He simply grew quiet in a culture that increasingly mistook noise for intelligence. So when he left his 2-bedroom apartment in Portland and purchased a dusty, sun-beaten property in a remote Arizonan development, no one was surprised that he told no one. There were no farewell drinks, no grand announcements, no social media posts. Just a one-line email to his publisher. The desert is better for thinking. The house was unremarkable to most. Flat-roofed, mid-century, with sun-blistered stucco walls and a warped wooden fence. But to Elliot, it was a clean slate, not metaphorically, but literally. The land was titled in full, unencumbered. The structure stood outside the flood zone. There were no easements, no co-owners, no historic preservation headaches. The only thing surrounding it was sand, sky, and a barely paved road that wound between a cluster of 15 or so homes, each more tightly clustered as you moved closer to the community center, which, to Elliot's mild amusement, was just a concrete square with a pair of picnic tables and a locked supply closet. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that felt designed, curated. A man in his 60s power-walked every morning in the same neon visor. A couple, too old to be holding hands but too stiff to let go, circled the block every evening with their dog. Everyone seemed to obey the invisible rules. Lawns uniformly graveled, fences painted the same almond shade, trash bins hidden in designated alcoves. It was unnerving, but not entirely unappealing. Order, Elliot always believed, had its place, so long as it didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. He had the house painted within the first month of moving in, not by contractors, but by himself, on weekends, deliberately, thoroughly, with a roller and a paintbrush. He chose a color he described to the paint clerk as desert fatigue, somewhere between washed sage and oxidized copper. The paint had an understated elegance to it, unassuming, soft on the eyes, and in Elliot's mind perfectly suited to the dusty backdrop of red rock and brittle creosote. The problem began, as many things do, with a knock at the door that came too early and lasted too long. He opened it to find a woman with the posture of a retired drill sergeant and the lipstick of a 1950s television host. Her name was Karen Hughes, and she was, as she introduced herself with an outstretched clipboard, the president of the Property Standards Committee. Not the board chair. Not the elected rep. No, she was the president of a self-declared body that sounded like it had rules, but, as Elliot would soon learn, mostly had preferences dressed as regulations. She didn't ask about the color. She simply looked past him at the fresh coat on the exterior walls, raised one eyebrow, and said, "This shade wasn't in the approved palette." Elliot, still holding his tea, looked at her calmly. "I didn't see a palette in the purchase documents." "Oh," she said almost sweetly, "we don't include it in the closing packet anymore. Too many people get confused. We have it available online." "I don't use the internet for non-essential information." "Well, then I suppose this is essential," she said, writing something down with a pen that clicked like a threat. He watched her walk away with short, purposeful strides and wondered how long it would take before she escalated. 2 days later, he got a formal letter, not typed but printed from a word processor, folded crookedly and stuffed in a plain white envelope. No letterhead, no barcode, just his name scrawled on the front and a warning inside. "Your property has been found in violation of Section 4.7, Harmonious Appearance Policy. You are hereby fined $50,000 to be paid within 30 days. He read the letter twice, once to understand it and once more to confirm it wasn't satire. Then he made tea, returned to his desk, and began reading through every document in the neighborhood's architectural guidelines, property covenants, and deed restrictions. He found vague references to visual conformity, no mention of specific colors, and certainly nothing that substantiated a $50,000 fine. The entire framework, it seemed, was built on community acceptance, which, as Karen likely knew, was just soft language for enforceable opinion. He didn't panic. Elliot didn't do panic. But he did respond, with a letter of his own, concise and footnoted, addressed to the committee and delivered by certified mail. In it, he asked 3 questions. Under what authority was the fine assessed? Where were the binding standards defined? And what legal standing did the committee hold in regard to private modifications? No response came, but the tone of the neighborhood shifted. The man in the visor stopped nodding when they passed each other. The couple with the dog avoided eye contact. Even the dog, which used to pause and sniff Elliot's curb, now kept walking. There were whispers of complaint, anonymous notes left in his mailbox about tone and neighborhood spirit. Someone, he assumed Karen, filed a request with the county to verify the structural code compliance of his home. 2 men in tan uniforms showed up to do a walkthrough. They found nothing, of course, but one apologized on the way out. "We get these calls sometimes," he muttered, "usually from people who think they own more than they do." Elliot realized then that this was not about color. It never had been. This was about power. Karen had made herself the arbiter of good taste, order, and obedience. And Elliot, by refusing to participate in the charade, had become a threat, not because he was unruly, but because he wasn't afraid of the consequences they tried to invent. She didn't want compliance. She wanted submission, and that Elliot Rowe would never give her. What she also didn't realize, not yet, was that in her crusade to discipline him, she had overlooked one critical detail. The road that led into the development, the only access point for all 15 homes, passed directly through a long strip of land that had never been properly transferred to the association. A narrow section about 60 feet wide had been deeded decades ago to the original builder's survey company, which later went bankrupt and defaulted. That land had passed to a creditor, then to the county, then sat in limbo. And now, according to public record, it had been purchased for $24 at a delinquent property auction by a man named Elliot Rowe. He had known about it before moving in. It was why he chose that house. And now that they had drawn first blood, he knew exactly what he was going to do with it. The morning the second letter arrived, Elliot was standing in his kitchen, boiling water for his tea. The desert light filtered in through the slats of his blinds, casting long horizontal shadows across the floor. He was halfway through scribbling a note about local property law interpretation in his legal pad when he noticed the envelope slid halfway through his front door. There had been no knock, no doorbell, just the sound of paper brushing wood, like someone feeding him a threat disguised as paperwork. He approached the door, picked it up, and immediately recognized the same Microsoft Word formatting, the same default serif font, the same passive-aggressive line spacing that screamed amateur bureaucracy dressed up as institutional authority. This one, however, had a bold heading. Final Notice of Enforcement. Unpaid Fine. Beneath it, in smaller print, a demand. $50,000 must be paid within 10 days to avoid further municipal proceedings, potential liens, or public listing as a delinquent property. Elliot held the letter in his hand for a full minute before setting it down beside his teacup. He didn't swear, didn't sigh, didn't even blink longer than usual. He simply walked to his office, opened a locked drawer, and removed the thin, dusty file labeled with a small yellow tag. Access Corridor, Lot 34B. Inside were the original auction transfer papers from the county land sale 6 months prior. Most people who glanced at the parcel ID would have assumed it was a ditch, a utility path, or a mistake. But Elliot had read the maps, compared plat overlays, and traced property lines until he found what no one else bothered to verify: that the only paved road into this neighborhood, ironically named Serenity Loop, passed through this 60-foot corridor that legally wasn't theirs to control. The rest of the street had been claimed over the years by homeowners' ad hoc repaving projects and overreach, but this section remained frozen in title limbo until Elliot claimed it. To be clear, it wasn't a large piece of land. It wasn't scenic. It wasn't worth anything in traditional development terms. But it was critical, because no one, not a single resident in the neighborhood, could reach their driveway without driving over that exact stretch. Karen's house, notably, was positioned so that her garage exited directly onto it. Back in his kitchen, Elliot poured hot water over loose-leaf tea, returned to his desk, and pulled up the local municipal code. The issue wasn't about vengeance or retaliation. It was about leverage. Elliot wasn't interested in humiliating Karen or inciting a battle with the rest of the residents. He didn't care whether they painted their fences beige or practiced synchronized lawn mowing. What concerned him now was the principle of consent. Consent to be governed, consent to be fined, consent to be managed by someone who had appointed herself judge and jury without jurisdiction. And since they had weaponized paper against him, it was time to sharpen his own. That afternoon, Elliot mailed a registered letter to the county assessor's office, requesting formal recognition of the parcel as active ingress-egress access corridor with limited commercial access rights. 2 days later, he received confirmation that the designation was acceptable. The key phrase was limited commercial use, which under state code meant he could charge for passage, provided it was done equitably, non-discriminatorily, and didn't impede emergency vehicles. He wasn't planning to build a gate or a toll booth. Not yet. But the mere existence of this designation gave him a tool. More importantly, it gave him the legal high ground. He had now transformed what had previously been an overlooked strip of asphalt into a recognized private transit segment with user access responsibility. He drafted a document, calm, neutral, no inflammatory language, titled Notification of Private Use Access Corridor Fee Structure. In it, he explained that due to an ongoing dispute regarding unauthorized financial penalties imposed upon his property, he would be implementing a provisional per-use maintenance fee for all private vehicles crossing the segment of road owned by him. The fee was nominal, $1.50 per use, payable via QR code linked to a third-party processing app with itemized digital receipts. Commercial vehicles would pay $3.50. Emergency services and postal carriers were exempt. The document was posted in a clear waterproof display on a metal stand Elliot installed at the edge of the corridor. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't dramatic. It was just there. Firm, factual, legal. He expected resistance. He did not expect immediate hysteria. By the second morning, the sign had been removed, ripped off actually, and discarded in the brush. Elliot replaced it with a steel-reinforced version, bolted into a concrete footing. That one lasted a day longer. He didn't argue or confront. Each time it disappeared, he installed another, this time adding a small solar-powered camera mounted to a fence post. When footage confirmed that a man in cargo shorts, one of Karen's friends likely, had destroyed the sign at 3:18 a.m. with a hammer, Elliot didn't call the police. He uploaded the footage, attached a timestamp, and included a letter to the man's insurance company with a repair estimate. No threats, just a calm assertion of accountability. Meanwhile, Karen escalated. Her letters became more dramatic. Her rhetoric shifted from community compliance to neighborhood safety, from aesthetic disturbance to threats to unity. She circulated flyers in mailboxes claiming Elliot was turning the community into a paper access experiment, warning that outsiders might soon gain control of their shared roads unless something was done. The irony, of course, was that Elliot had never proposed charging anyone anything until Karen tried to fine him into submission. The neighborhood message board, once dormant, lit up with posts. Some were supportive, quiet, cautious, but present. Others were furious. The loudest were confused, unsure whether Elliot was a tyrant or a genius. One man, a retired civil engineer named Lawrence, knocked on Elliot's door under the pretense of borrowing a wrench. They spoke for nearly an hour. Lawrence wasn't there to challenge him. He simply wanted to know if it was true that the entire neighborhood had overlooked a critical section of land ownership for decades, and that now, because of a $50,000 color dispute, the gatekeeper to their only point of entry had decided to enforce the rules they themselves had neglected. Elliot said only this: "I didn't decide anything. I followed the law. They didn't." A week later, Elliot received a notice from a third-party firm representing the community board, a formal legal threat alleging obstruction of public right-of-way, misuse of private land, and economic disruption. He read it, as always, with calm detachment. The firm had mischaracterized the corridor as a part of the shared infrastructure. Elliot responded with maps, deeds, legal precedents, and a statement from the county clarifying his ownership. He filed a countersuit, not for damages, not for publicity, but for declaratory judgment and indemnification. He wanted it in writing, in a courtroom, that the land was his, the road was his, and that no one, not Karen, not her board, not their lawyers, could penalize him for refusing to bow to fiction dressed as regulation. Elliot didn't need allies, but what he got, slowly and silently, were residents who began to question what they had assumed was settled. If Karen could fine a man $50,000 for a muted paint color, what else could she claim authority over? If she had lied about the rules, bent them, or invented them, what else was arbitrary? If their access point could be seized from beneath their tires without them even knowing it had happened, what did that say about the very foundation of their so-called order? This wasn't about color, it was about control. And Elliot Rowe had just taken it back. Elliot Rowe had never been a man to provoke. He preferred precision over provocation, process over spectacle, but even he had to admit that the events of the past 2 weeks had placed him into a position that required escalation. Not through shouting, not through spectacle, but through deliberate, structured response. By the time the third version of his corridor sign was torn down, not in the night but in broad daylight, by a woman who looked directly into the solar camera with a smug smile and a middle finger, Elliot knew that this would not be resolved quietly. The footage was clear, the act was deliberate, and the message was undeniable. They were daring him to respond. What they hadn't calculated for was that Elliot didn't rattle, and he didn't escalate in the way most people did. He responded with structure, weight, and consequence. That same afternoon, he filed for a temporary injunction with the county court to restrict physical interference with his property under civil nuisance provisions. He didn't sue for damages, yet. He simply sought judicial acknowledgement that repeated tampering constituted unlawful interference. His lawyer, a practical, gray-suited man from Tucson, submitted it within hours. The hearing was scheduled within 3 days. Elliot didn't attend in person. He didn't need to. The evidence was submitted digitally, the footage was time-stamped and geolocated, and the documentation of ownership was airtight. The judge issued a preliminary order barring residents from removing or damaging any signage or equipment placed on the corridor for the duration of the legal review. A copy of the order was posted alongside the new sign Elliot installed. This one was made of powder-coated steel and bolted to a concrete base sunk 3 feet into the earth. At its base, he placed laminated copies of the injunction in waterproof sleeves. There would be no more misunderstandings. And then came the pamphlets. They appeared in mailboxes overnight. Professionally printed, glossy, with bold red lettering that read, "Defend Serenity Loop. Reject toll gates. Reject tyranny." The pamphlet accused Elliot of holding the neighborhood hostage, of exploiting and obscure legal technicality to install a paywall, and warned residents that this is just the beginning unless we act. It was unsigned, but the writing was unmistakably Karen's, flowery, manipulative, and self-congratulatory in its tone. She referred to Elliot's actions as a civic invasion, as though he were a foreign agent rather than a man enforcing a legal boundary. She claimed he was profiting from the backs of his neighbors, though Elliot hadn't collected a single cent yet. The fee system was installed but still paused, pending the court's final decision. She even included a mocked-up photo of the corridor with barbed wire fencing and a cash register on a folding table, a visual piece of satire so ridiculous that it bordered on parody. And yet, some people believed it. Some always do. Soon after, Elliot noticed vehicles slowing as they approached the sign, some drivers glaring out the window, others mouthing insults or making hand gestures. One man stopped, got out of his car, and began loudly reciting a list of supposed constitutional violations, ending with a threat to take this to the governor if I have to. Elliot stood at the edge of his property saying nothing. He didn't need to argue. The documents did that for him. But then Karen went further. She filed a formal complaint with the County Code Enforcement Division, alleging that Elliot's modifications, including his signpost, the QR scanner, and the mounted camera, violated visual pollution ordinances and created psychological discomfort. She used that term repeatedly, embedding it in every paragraph like it was a real statute. Elliot's lawyer responded within the hour, citing the property code's exceptions for traffic management and utility installations. A week later, the county dismissed the complaint, stating in no uncertain terms that the installations were legal and that psychological discomfort was not a recognized basis for enforcement. But the damage wasn't in the filing. The damage was in the narrative. Karen wasn't trying to win in court, she was trying to shape perception, to poison the communal well, to turn Elliot into the symbol of everything the neighborhood feared: disruption, unpredictability, independence. Then came the blockade. One morning, Elliot awoke to find 3 folding tables and 8 camping chairs arranged across the corridor with laminated signs reading, "Community Access Point, free passage only, no private fees." Behind the tables sat a rotating crew of residents, including Karen herself, who perched in a reinforced lawn chair under a beach umbrella like a queen overseeing her kingdom. They weren't blocking access outright, which would have given Elliot legal recourse for obstruction. They were simply monitoring the corridor, handing out flyers, waving cars through while pointing at Elliot's signs with theatrical disapproval. The stunt was clever. It was petty. It was also temporary. Elliot recorded everything, compiled a dossier of photos, and filed an amendment to his existing injunction, citing coordinated interference and misrepresentation of property rights. He also issued a cease and desist letter to Karen, delivered by courier, with a notarized copy to the community board's post office box. 2 days later, Karen's makeshift occupation disappeared. But the hostility did not. Someone poured gravel into the housing of Elliot's QR terminal, jamming the scanning system. Someone else, or perhaps the same person, left a bag of dog feces at the base of his signpost, wrapped in one of the pamphlets. Elliot replaced the terminal with a newer model, encased in tamper-proof plastic and equipped with remote monitoring. He began forwarding each incident to his attorney and quietly submitted an insurance claim for vandalism, which paid out $100 or $200 to cover upgrades and labor. He didn't respond in kind. He didn't raise his voice. But the signs stayed up. The camera stayed active. The payment system stayed live. And then Karen made her biggest mistake yet. She organized a closed-door vote among the residents, claiming emergency authority to revise the community rules. She proposed a motion declaring that all roads within the development were now shared public property under unified community governance, and that any individual asserting control over any segment shall be considered in violation. She rigged the numbers, hand-delivered voting slips to select households, and excluded others entirely. The vote passed, on paper at least. When Elliot received a copy of the results, he responded not with outrage, but with documentation. He filed a report with the county registrar, enclosing the vote language, the manipulated mailing list, and the procedural violations, including testimony from 2 residents who had been excluded. Within 10 days, the registrar issued a ruling invalidating the vote and issuing a warning to the board against future misuse of authority under the threat of administrative review. But Elliott didn't stop there. He commissioned a professional traffic surveyor to evaluate the corridor's use and wear, documenting the frequency of passage, the vehicle load, and the associated maintenance costs. The report concluded that Elliott's section bore nearly 90% of all neighborhood traffic, and that the cost of maintaining that strip, pothole repair, resurfacing, runoff management, was approximately $3,400 annually. He sent a letter to each household enclosing the report and a simple notice. Beginning next month, maintenance fees will be applied according to proportional use. Participation in shared maintenance may exempt you from per-use charges. Not all residents resisted. A handful signed on. Quietly, anonymously. But it was enough. Elliott didn't need to win everyone. He just needed to win legally. And that part, he had already done. The shift didn't come with a bang. It didn't arrive wrapped in triumph or announced by a legal victory. It came, as most meaningful changes do, in silence. Elliott was in the middle of reviewing a new surveyor's draft when he noticed something unusual. The tone of the neighborhood had softened. Not entirely, not uniformly, but something had shifted in the way people moved past his property. The morning joggers no longer stared pointedly at his sign. The man with the Labrador, who once crossed the street to avoid walking near his fence, paused just long enough to nod. It wasn't friendliness, not yet, but it wasn't hostility either. It was wariness tempered by doubt, and Elliott recognized it immediately. It was the beginning of a narrative unraveling. In the weeks since the community vote had been invalidated by the registrar's office, the board had gone uncharacteristically quiet. Karen had not issued a new pamphlet. No new complaints had been filed. The message board posts that had once bristled with aggression were now conspicuously mundane. Someone asked about termite control. Someone else posted a recipe for zucchini bread. It was almost suspicious in its domesticity. Elliott didn't assume the storm had passed. He knew better. He didn't believe in sudden peace. He believed in pauses, in recalculations, in the kind of quiet that predators make when they crouch to spring. So he prepared. He documented every minor incident. Each time someone scraped his post, each time a trash bin was moved slightly out of alignment. Every subtle form of psychological pressure that Karen's circle had previously used to wear down resistance. He recorded license plates, dates, weather conditions. He wasn't paranoid. He was building a record. And then, one afternoon, the pattern broke. A small white envelope appeared in his mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and nothing else. The handwriting was clean, sharp, unmistakably male. The note read, "Not everyone believes her. She lied to us, too. The corridor was never part of the agreement. Look at the annex in 1998. Elliott stared at the paper for a long time, then walked back into the house, opened his filing cabinet, and began to dig. It took him over an hour to find what he was looking for, an overlooked addendum in the original developer's plan, buried in a 1998 county filing. It contained a parcel exclusion clause stating that any unclaimed roadway not formally transferred to the board within 24 months of the developer's dissolution would remain under independent jurisdiction. The clause had never been repealed. It was still active. Now he had not just ownership, but history, context. He wasn't a man who stumbled into a technicality. He was a man standing on the foundation they had chosen to ignore. He made copies of the annex, scanned it, archived it with the rest of his documentation, and sent it to his attorney. The reply was swift and direct. "This puts us in a different league. You're not just right, you're rooted." The board must have sensed it too. That week, Elliott received a letter requesting a private meeting to resolve community tension. He declined. He didn't do backroom deals. Instead, he wrote back, "Any proposals may be submitted in writing. All communication will be retained for legal purposes." No meeting was held. But the next day, a new letter arrived. This time, it was polished, diplomatic, carefully worded. Karen spoke of neighborhood cohesion, mutual compromise, and offered to dismiss all previous fines and waive future reviews if Elliot would consider pausing the toll infrastructure on his road. The message was clear. She wanted to retreat without losing face. Elliot considered it for exactly 3 days. Then he sent back a single-page reply. "I appreciate the offer. I am not, however, interested in negotiations under threat. The fees remain in place. Future correspondence should be directed through legal channels. Respectfully, Elliot Rowe." He mailed copies to the board, his attorney, and the county records office. And just like that, control snapped back into his hands like a coiled wire. 48 hours later, the board called an emergency public meeting. Elliot didn't attend. He didn't need to. They weren't meeting to fight him anymore. They were meeting to figure out how to survive him. That night, 3 different neighbors came to his door. One to ask for a copy of the 1998 annex, another to offer voluntary contribution to the maintenance fund, and the third, a soft-spoken woman who had previously opposed him, to say, "I didn't know about the clause. That changes everything." Elliot didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply nodded, thanked her, and closed the door. It wasn't a surrender, but it was a shift. And for Elliot Rowe, a shift was enough. The false calm that had blanketed Serenity Loop for 2 weeks cracked just before dawn. Elliot had risen early, not out of worry but from habit. He never trusted stillness that settled too perfectly after a battle. It always meant something was being staged in the background. That morning, he sipped his tea while reading through a contractor's bid on a reinforced curb extension he planned to install along the edge of the corridor. He hadn't even finished the second page when a sharp rapping at the door broke his focus. It wasn't a knock. It was an intentional, rapid percussion of authority. Through the peephole, he saw a man in county inspector attire, flanked by another holding a clipboard and wearing a plain navy polo. Elliot opened the door without ceremony. "Morning, sir," the first man said, a little too briskly. "We're conducting a site inspection based on multiple complaints submitted to the zoning office. There have been allegations of unauthorized utility routing, underground conduit violations, and drainage modifications." Elliot didn't move. "And what's the basis for those complaints?" The inspector glanced at the clipboard. "Filed anonymously through the community review liaison. We're obligated to check." He didn't argue. He didn't obstruct. He simply stepped aside and motioned them through. They walked the property line, inspecting ground elevation, utility boxes, and measuring slope runoffs. It took almost an hour. They found nothing. As they prepared to leave, the second man, clearly less comfortable than the first, turned and said, "Look, off the record, someone's throwing everything they've got at you." Elliot didn't respond. He didn't need to. The message was already clear. By noon, the day's second maneuver was underway. A crew arrived with orange cones and yellow caution tape, unannounced, and began sectioning off Elliot's stretch of the corridor. When asked, the foreman mumbled something about scheduled community resurfacing, but had no work order, no authorization, and no county verification. Elliot called the transportation department. Within 30 minutes, the crew was gone. Left behind was the smell of hot tar and incompetence. It was a declaration of intent. Karen wasn't backing down. She had lost in court, lost in precedent, and lost the control she'd once wrapped around the neighborhood like a noose. Now, she was reverting to tactics born of desperation, using process as a weapon, hoping that constant, coordinated nuisance would exhaust Elliot into compromise. But she underestimated his stamina, and she gravely misunderstood his patience. The following morning, Elliott filed a report with the county's legal compliance office citing unauthorized municipal impersonation. He also sent a formal notice to the community board that any further interference with his quarter would result in civil litigation under misuse of public resources. But then the board changed tactics. They stopped going after Elliott directly. They went after his connections. The contractor who was scheduled to pour concrete for Elliott's curb received a call from someone claiming to be from the county permitting office, warning him of complications associated with work on disputed land. The contractor, nervous and underinsured, canceled without explanation. Next, Elliott's trash collection was accidentally suspended, despite his payments being fully current. When he contacted the service provider, they told him the board had requested a pause in service for non-compliant parcels. That same day, the mail stopped arriving. Each incident on its own could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern. Elliott gathered it all into a new legal submission, building a case not for one act of harassment, but for a sustained campaign of obstruction. His lawyer advised him to wait, to collect more, to build a timeline. Elliott agreed, but he wasn't idle. He called the contractor back. Not to complain, but to offer him a new contract with a retainer. Then he hired a second one, then a third. If they wanted to block him quietly, he would build louder. Within 10 days, crews were working 6 days a week to improve drainage, stabilize the soil, and repave the entire corridor segment with double-bonded asphalt. Not only did the new surface reduce noise and dust, it also exceeded the standards of any other stretch of road in the neighborhood. Karen called it provocation. Elliott called it stewardship. When the construction wrapped, he posted a new notice. Private corridor surface rehabilitation completed. Maintenance surcharge reduced to 0.75 per vehicle. Pro bono access for contributors remains unchanged. The board didn't issue a response, but someone else did. 3 cars, each belonging to known associates of Karen, began parking directly across the corridor's entrance every morning. They didn't block the road. They didn't technically trespass. They simply hovered, watching, engines idling, pretending to check their phones. Elliott watched them back, quietly, patiently. Then one night he returned from a supply run to find his sign, the bolted steel post with laminated documents and county map overlays, doused in engine oil and set aflame. The fire had already burned out by the time he arrived, but the blackened frame stood like a ruined flag at the edge of his land. He didn't speak. He didn't curse. He went inside, printed a fresh copy of the documents, and bolted a new frame to a second base, this time reinforced with rebar and filled with fast-set concrete. Then he called the fire department, not to report arson, but to request a safety inspection. When they arrived, they found no hazard, but the incident report logged unknown accelerant use on signage structure, and a copy was automatically shared with the sheriff's department. 2 days later, Elliott received a visit, not from the board, not from an inspector, but from a local deputy. The man was young, polite, and visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Rowe," he said, "I'm here as part of a welfare check. We received a report that you might be suffering emotional distress, potentially escalating behavior. Someone mentioned the word militia." Elliott stared at him in disbelief. "I have no weapons, no political flags, no threats on record, and I own a fire extinguisher in every room. What part of that suggests I'm a threat?" The deputy sighed. "I know, sir. I'm just here because we're required to follow up." "Then follow up," Elliott said, and opened the door wide. The deputy walked through, inspected, checked every room, drank a glass of water, apologized. Before leaving, he turned and said, "I shouldn't say this, but they're not going to stop until you give them something they can use." Elliott replied without hesitation, "Then I'll make sure they never get it." The next morning, he received a certified letter from the board's legal team claiming Elliot had engaged in targeted intimidation, civil disruption, and, most outrageously, excessive environmental hardscaping. He scanned it, then walked outside and looked at his clean, repaved, regulation-compliant stretch of corridor. No trash, no graffiti, no weeds. It looked better than any street in town. He walked back inside and drafted a response. 1 page, 10 citations, 2 maps, and a request for a public correction under the Defamation Through Process statute. He CC'd the county. He CC'd the State Ethics Board, and he mailed it all by hand. The war had gone quiet again. But Elliot Rowe wasn't just ready. He was fortified. The final confrontation didn't come with another letter. It didn't arrive by mail or courier or masked in legalese. It came, appropriately, in the middle of a board meeting broadcast over a Zoom link no one had bothered to secure. Elliot hadn't planned to watch it, but a neighbor, a man who'd quietly contributed to the maintenance fund without ever speaking to Elliot in person, slipped him the login information on a slip of paper taped to his mailbox. The meeting had been scheduled as a routine quarterly review, but the title of the agenda told a different story. Emergency Measures Regarding Roadway Access and Community Safety. Elliot sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, logged in, and watched as names popped onto the screen, faces arranged in neat little boxes, some grim, some eager, some distracted. At the center of it all was Karen, perfectly backlit and seated in front of a fireplace that didn't need to be burning in late spring. Her voice, when she began, was calculatedly warm. She framed the issue delicately, suggesting that the ongoing strain between residents and a certain individual had reached a point where collective action must now be considered. She cited community fragmentation, emotional fatigue, vehicular, hesitation at the corridor's entrance, her words chosen carefully to imply menace without accusation. But what she proposed next was bolder than even Elliot expected. She wanted to file for a municipal intervention order, essentially a request to the county to seize operational control over Elliot's portion of the road under an exceptional public interest clause. If granted, the measure would allow the board to manage maintenance, signage, and access policy under the guise of protecting public continuity. It wasn't eminent domain, but it was close, and it was just outrageous enough that, in the wrong hands, it could work. She opened the floor for discussion, expecting murmured agreement. Instead, the meeting splintered. One resident asked, not confrontationally but plainly, how such a takeover would be funded. Another asked what would happen to Elliot's investment in the road, his documentation, his court wins, his legal precedent. Karen deflected, dodged, redirected. She referred vaguely to external resources and ongoing consultations. Then someone interrupted. A voice Elliot hadn't heard before, dry and measured, cut through the screen. "My name is Randall Morris. I'm a land use attorney for the Arizona Municipal Oversight Office. I was asked to observe this meeting after receiving notice of unusual procedural activity involving private land designation." Silence fell. Karen froze. Randall continued, calm and devastating. "We've reviewed the proposed motion, and I want to clarify for the board and all present. Any action attempting to override deeded ownership through administrative fiat will be challenged, and based on the documents already submitted by Mr. Rowe and our office's prior inquiries, you will lose, not hypothetically, immediately, with costs." Karen's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Randall's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I would strongly suggest this board drop the motion and return to ordinary business. If you do not, the office will file an injunction within 24 hours. That is not a threat. That is our responsibility." The meeting ended 17 minutes later. No vote was held. No motion was advanced. Karen logged off first. Elliot sat in silence, his hands still on the keyboard. Not from shock, but from the strange stillness that follows a bullet you never had to fire. He had prepared for everything: legal retaliation, false accusations, procedural ambushes, but he hadn't anticipated the moment when the system, finally, on its own terms, decided to correct itself. He closed the laptop, walked outside, and looked at the corridor. The pavement glowed under the setting sun, smooth, dark, and undisturbed. The signs stood clean. The cameras still tracked the entrance, and for the first time in months, there was nothing moving at the edge of the property. The next morning, the board released a statement, brief, neutral, clearly scrubbed by counsel, announcing a reassessment of ongoing community initiatives and the dissolution of recent emergency proposals. Karen's name was not included. Her signature was absent. 3 days later, she resigned. No announcement, no farewell. Just a handwritten note taped to the bulletin board at the mail kiosk. Effective immediately, I am stepping away from board leadership to focus on personal matters. Thank you for the opportunity to serve. Elliot didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just read it, noted the date, and walked away. There were no fireworks, no confrontations in the street. Karen didn't return to the corridor, didn't make a final play. Her name vanished from the bylaws. Her supporters melted into quiet compliance. The patrol cars stopped circling his lot. The trash pickup resumed. Mail returned. Contractors started answering the phone again. And Elliot? He ordered a small bronze plaque. Clean, discreet, mounted at the corner of the corridor where it met the main street. It read, Private Corridor. Maintained through contribution. Order without coercion. Access without fear. It wasn't a monument. It was a message. To anyone who came after, and to anyone still watching. In the weeks that followed Karen's resignation, the neighborhood settled into a rhythm that felt oddly unfamiliar. Not because it was quiet, but because it stayed that way. The tension that had once charged the air like static clinging to every fence post and mailbox dissipated so gradually that Elliot almost didn't notice it leaving. No one knocked on his door. No new letters arrived. The corridor remained untouched. The laminated documents under the rebar-framed sign stayed clean, unvandalized, fluttering slightly in the wind like flags that no longer needed defending. Elliot maintained the toll system, though he never enforced it. The payment terminal remained active, the signage clear, but he never chased anyone down, never issued notices, never filed collections. And yet, people began to pay. Not everyone, but enough. It started with small transfers, 75 cents here, a few dollars there, and then, gradually, recurring monthly payments began to appear from familiar names. Some sent notes with their payments. Thanks for keeping it clean. Appreciate the effort. Better than the board ever did. Elliot didn't respond to them. He didn't need to. What mattered was not the money. It was the recognition. They no longer saw him as a threat or an outlier. He had become something much more potent, a boundary. Not just between properties, but between chaos and structure, between false authority and earned responsibility. The corridor had started as a tool of leverage. It had become a line in the sand. Now it was simply part of the neighborhood, the way it should have been all along. He made no effort to involve himself in the board's reformation. When elections were held, he didn't attend the meeting. He didn't vote. He didn't campaign. But he noticed with quiet satisfaction that the new leadership included 2 residents who had once stood with Karen, and who now publicly advocated for transparency, limited governance, and voluntary contribution models. They didn't mention Elliot by name, but their platform spoke his language. Occasionally he would pass Karen's house, still occupied, curtains drawn more often now, the lawn maintained but lacking its former perfection. She didn't wave. He didn't expect her to. She had not disappeared in disgrace. She had simply receded, like a wave that had reached too far and learned the shape of the shore. Elliot bore her no hatred. He didn't need her contrition. The conflict had never been personal, not to him. It had been about systems, about consent, about refusing to be ruled by fear disguised as order. He spent more time outside now, not because he was watching, he didn't need to watch, but because the silence had changed. It was no longer a warning. It was peace. He gardened, repainted the side shed, spent long mornings reading under the porch awning, the Arizona sun catching the edges of his notes. He resumed writing, quietly, slowly, not about the war he had just fought, but about the concept of boundary itself. Not walls, not gates, not fences, but boundary as a philosophy, where responsibility begins, where interference ends, how people learn the difference between living next to someone and trying to control them. The corridor never became famous. It never appeared in the paper. No reporters came. No social media campaigns exploded around it. And that, Elliot thought, was perhaps the most fitting victory of all. It wasn't noise that protected the space. It was consistency, law, and a refusal to yield to invented authority. One afternoon, months after the last letter had been sent, Elliot received a small envelope. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper, handwritten in an uneven hand. It read, "You didn't make me like you, but you made me stop being afraid of her. That matters." No name. No return address. He folded the note, placed it in a file marked Correspondence, and returned to his desk. Outside, the corridor was quiet. Not because it had to be, but because it could be.